In this message, I want to share the final two commitments to help us get the very best out of our lives that make a difference in our world and in the people around us. And I want to do that by looking at some of the transferable principles that the Apostle Paul shared having to do with the world of sports, of Greek sports. Paul loved sports, and he often drew analogies from the sporting world, from the field of competition. Paul saw life as running a race and gaining the prize. Paul writes in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 26, "So I do not run aimlessly. I do not box as one beating the air, but I discipline my body and keep it under control, lest after preaching to others, I myself should be disqualified." The first great commitment, take the higher way over the lesser way. The second great commitment, choose the harder way over the easier way. Notice what Paul says here. I discipline myself. He's talking about inner qualities here, attributes that define us, the integrity, the loyalty, the values, the commitments that we make. He said, I do not run aimlessly. I'm not like a boxer punching the air. I commit myself to discipline, to the harder way over the easier way. I look at the long-term purpose. I practice delayed gratification. I show up, I do the work. Paul saw life as a fight, a race, a commitment to the harder way over the easier way. Years ago, I was at the United States Military Academy at West Point on a preaching mission. I wasn't the lead guy, I was in support. And I remember being there and talking to one of the cadets, one of the plebes, the first year cadets. And he said, well, we can only say three things here in our first year. Yes, sir, no, sir, and no excuse, sir. I thought, that's not a bad way to raise some kids, is it? Yes, sir, no, excuse, sir. And I asked him, I said, now, let me ask you a question. Why are you here? In other words, you could be at Harvard or Yale or some great party school around the country. I noticed at this time that you're only permitted to go home for Christmas, that you have a very rigid schedule. You get up at 6 o'clock in the morning, they turn the lights out at 10 o'clock at night. You have almost no free time. You're totally committed, overcommitted. You go to classes, you march, you do sports, you study, you eat, you go to bed. Why did you choose such a tough life? And he said, well, you see, sir, I've learned that the easier way in the long run is often the harder way. And the harder way in the long run is often the easier way. I'm committed to higher goals and purposes in my life. And I'm willing to delay my gratification to receive them. There's a certain character that takes place there, a willingness to take the hard way over the easier way. Church is like that sometimes. Have you heard the definition of the church, that it's like a football game? That it's 100,000 people in the stands desperately in need of exercise and 22 people on the field desperately in need of rest? That sometimes we don't get as involved or as active or committed to the church and the harder things of the church that we should be to get to that higher way in life. Sometimes we tend to take it easy. Tom Landry, the old head coach of the Dallas Cowboys, said, my job is to get 22 grown men to all do what they don't want to do so that they can all get what they all want to get. My job is to get them to take the harder way over the easier way. Do not run aimlessly, punching the air. Commitment to the harder way over the easier way. Paul said, I discipline myself. Which causes me to ask the question, where do I settle for less, for the easier, for the compromise? Where could I up the ante and say, no, I'll take the delayed gratification, the hard way to get to the good stuff, to the prize, to finishing the race. 2 Timothy 4:7. I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race. I have kept the faith. 3 great commitments of the sporting world for Paul. A commitment to take the higher way over the lesser way. A commitment to choose the harder way over the easier way. And here, a commitment to trust God's way over my way. Notice the words that Paul uses here. Fought, finished, kept. I have been committed to do that which frightens me, to face my hurts and my fears and my failures, to stand over and above my anxiety, to do those things that I normally wouldn't do myself, because in this last great commitment, I am committed to trust in God's way, not my way. And I will live with the consequences of my convictions. I choose to trust and live by faith. So the question becomes, well, how do we know God's way? How do we train? How do we race? How do we win the prize? Well, the good news for us is that God speaks to us. He's revealed himself to us. He tells us how to do that. Paul writes to us, an athlete is not crowned unless he competes according to the rules. Paul is saying God has given us certain boundary lines, certain guidelines, certain directions to head in. I mean, if you take away home plate and the baselines and the rules and the umpires and the strike zone and the bat boy, we'd all be running around aimlessly in circles. We wouldn't know where to go or how to play the game. We require foul lines, boundary lines, end zones, out of bounds lines to let us know where we are on the field. So in following my way is a very limited way. I'm looking at life from a finite vantage point, from a limited perspective. I'm looking at life from my own internal feelings many times. But God gives us an external perspective from an infinite vantage point, an objective truth source, a perspective to lead and guide and direct us. It's his holy word. And I can tell you that I have spent mountains of regret in my lifetime when I have not followed that word, when I have not lived inside the boundary lines. But I have not had one moment of regret every time I have lived within the guidelines that God has given to me. See, God has given us certain guidelines and boundary lines with our best interest in mind. It's how we play the game. It's how we run the race. And once we know who to follow and what the ground rules are and what he's said and how to play the game, we see life differently. We face problems differently. We make decisions differently. It changes the whole trajectory of our life. God says, follow my way. Trust me. Think of a football. It represents so much more than a football. A football represents something that people devote their lives to on Saturdays and Sundays. People orient their entire lives around a football team. And there are coaches and contributions and student bodies and clothing and TV contracts and tailgate parties. A football is far more than a football. And it's the same with God's word. It's far more than just a book. It's a revelation. God speaks to us. He tells us the rules, the boundary lines, the guidelines. He tells us how to play the game. Now he says, you can play the game your way, or you can play the game my way. Trust me, my way is a good way for you. It is a good path to follow. Be committed to trusting God's way over my way. My grandmother, when I would visit her in the summer, she had this giant picture puzzles on a small fold-up table, and she would tell me to put the puzzle back together. I'd stay with her for a week, and I'd always want to turn the box over to see the picture of what it looked like at the end. All the puzzle pieces were in the box, and she'd say, no, you can't look at that picture. You have to figure out these little pieces by themselves, and they were hard because they were landscapes. They all look the same color. So you start slowly piecing that puzzle back together. It's the same with life. God knows how the pieces go together. He knows what the picture looks like. We don't. And he says, but I will show you how to put the pieces together. I will assemble them for you. I know life can be confusing. It can be difficult. It can be maddening. Sometimes you can get completely lost and frustrated in the pieces. Trust me, I will put the puzzle back together again for you. And in that process, God makes provisions for the frustration, for the failures, for when the picture doesn't make sense. One of my friends, when I was doing chapel services for the Steelers, was Gary Anderson. Gary Anderson was the kicker for the Pittsburgh Steelers. He retired in 2004 as the all-time NFL leading scorer, a kicker. In 1998, he had for the Minnesota Vikings what was called the perfect season. 35 field goals and 39 extra points without missing. Without missing. In the playoffs, in the National Football Championship against the Atlanta Falcons, he missed a 39-yard field goal with 2 minutes left, and the team lost the game in overtime. Gary was absolutely devastated. He went from the perfect season to one failure that was devastating to him in his life. How quickly and unexpectedly life can turn around on us. Now, in Gary's case, because he followed God's way and submits himself to God's will, he's turned up to have a fantastic life and a whole ministry called The Perfect Season. It's amazing how quickly life can turn, isn't it? Failures in our lives. Jack Ham, that all-pro linebacker for the Steelers, said the difference between an all-pro and a world-class athlete who plays in the National Football League is that the all-pros really learn how to play at peak capacity when they are hurt. Because it's when you're hurt that you find out who you really are and what's important and what matters and what you value and who you really follow in life. And so maybe you can ask, who have I been following? My way or God's way? Which way do I want to go in life? Paul wrote in Philippians 1:21, for me to live is Christ, and to die is to gain more of him. For me to live is Jesus. And if I died, I'd just get more of him. Somebody like that's unbeatable. They're invincible. Paul says, I am committed. I am committed. And I know that my commitment, that which I am committed to, will define me, will shape me. I'm committed. I'm committed to running this race, to gaining the prize. And I want you to be committed as well. Winning the race, gaining the prize. 3 great commitments. A commitment to take the higher way over the lesser way. A commitment to choose the harder way over the easier way. And a commitment to trust God's way over my way. Now let's get started and run the race.